I may as well tell you right off the bat, Guts is my favorite character of all fiction, and that's as much for personal reasons, which I won't go into today, as for his writing. While some may only see him as an iconic badass character who kills people with his big sword, Guts is in truth a character whose writing is far more subtle, and whose personality is far deeper than you might think at first glance. And it's obviously in order to convince you of this that I've decided to make the most complete analysis I can of Guts. And I warn you, there's a lot to say. I hesitated to do this video in several parts, but since it's so close to my heart, I might as well make it the biggest video on the channel. For those of you who are too lazy to watch it all at once, I've put together a chaptering system that divides the video into several parts, so you can watch it in installments and pick up where you left off quite easily, so I encourage you to do that. But anyway, as I mentioned in the previous video on causality, when Kentaro Miura started Berserk, he had no idea where he was going with his story or who Guts really was. He just created a dark, tortured character, obsessed with revenge, unsympathetic and half-mad, and if certain things seem to suggest that it's more complex than that, and that Miura is setting up some elements that he'll use later without having planned it, making them coherent in retrospect, when the reader discovers Guts on his first reading, he can only ask himself one thing: how did he get there? What could have happened to Guts to bring him to this level of madness? And above all, what could Griffith have done to him to make him hate him so much? After the end of the Slug Apostle storyline, Berserk's publication was interrupted by the closure of its pre-publication magazine, Animal House. At the time, Miura was also working on a manga in collaboration with Buronson, the scriptwriter of Hokuto no Ken, and literally one of the most important figures in the history of manga, who was at the height of his fame at that time. But Miura, too attached to his first original creation, refused to continue his collaboration with Buronson to continue his manga in his new pre-publication magazine, Young Animal, knowing that he would have to start from scratch for his new audience. And he'll literally start from scratch, beginning his new arc, The Golden Age, at the birth of Guts, taking us through the most important passages of his childhood and adolescence, to explain how all this hatred and madness was born in him. Guts' childhood, while occupying a fairly short part of the manga, is an extremely important passage in our understanding of the character of Guts and his personality. Of course, if there's one crucial period in the development of a person's psychology, it's childhood. And it's an understatement to say that Guts' childhood wasn't a tender one, and that it left him with traumas that will follow him for the rest of his life. Guts was born of a dead woman. His mother was killed, hung from a tree, and gave birth after her death. Guts loses his biological mother before he is even born and has to fight to survive from the very first moments of his life. And although he is adopted by Sis, who offers him the only maternal love he has ever known, she dies of the plague when he's just 3 years old. So Guts never really had a mother, childhood amnesia having probably made him forget almost everything about his adoptive mother. No, the only parent he had during his childhood was Gambino, who served as his adoptive father. And it can't be said that this resulted in a healthy father-son relationship. Gambino is a violent father, using Guts from an early age by plunging him unscrupulously into the heart of a world of extreme violence, that of the battlefield. When he was 6, he took him there to act as his assistant. For Guts, it's the first time he's seen people being killed, a traumatic event in itself. But he doesn't even have the luxury of worrying about it, as he's also risking his life, and will have to help Gambino to stay alive. Gambino also trains him violently in swordplay, with an adult sword at that, and it's the only thing he passes on to Guts in the end, the only real bond between them. In fact, Gambino's only act of kindness is the balm he gives Guts, to heal the nose injury he inflicted on him during training, after realizing that Guts was secretly training with a sword, and you'll see how important this moment is later on. It is thanks to this that the sword will become for Guts one of the most important things in his life, his only source of comfort. It's clear when he says that when he's wielding his sword, he doesn't have to think about anything else, that he doesn't have to think about the violence in which he's immersed on a daily basis, be it physical or even verbal. And this is perfectly illustrated in the scene where, while Guts is suffering from the wound inflicted on him by Gambino during training, he overhears mercenaries accusing him of being responsible for his mother's death and of bringing bad luck. His only reflex to protect himself from this verbal violence and ease his pain, his only source of comfort, is to take his sword and sleep against it, like a cuddly toy, or even like a mother. Because yes, if you're into a bit of intellectual wanking, and I warn you there will be some, Guts' sword will almost play the role of a mother during his childhood, the only thing that will make him forget his suffering and protect him. This symbolism is clearly demonstrated in this scene, where the two soldiers remind us at once that his biological and adoptive mothers are dead, and we see that the only thing left to comfort Guts is his sword. But it's at the age of 9 that the most important moment in Guts' childhood takes place. First of all, he will experience his first siege and kill a man for the first time in his life, which is a milestone in itself, especially for a child, even if, given the violence in which he has always been immersed, this fact becomes almost anecdotal. But the event that really marks a turning point in his childhood is, of course, the rape he's going to suffer, perpetrated by Donovan, who tells him that Gambino sold him for 3 pieces of silver. Guts refuses to believe this for a long time, and even kills Donovan in revenge shortly afterwards, trying as best he can to convince himself that he alone was responsible for his rape. In spite of this, unfortunately for the credibility of Guts' writing, I'd like to say, this rape will have enormous repercussions on him in his everyday life, and we'll have a chance to talk more about this later in the video. At the same time, Gambino loses a leg in battle and can no longer fight. He'll end up living off Guts, who will roam the battlefields as a mercenary to earn money for Gambino's booze and prostitutes, all the while being treated like a dog and trying to convince himself that Gambino didn't sell him out to Donovan. And while it may seem odd that he'd do all this, you have to remember that Guts saw Gambino as his father, even as his only family, since he didn't seem to have any relationship with anyone else. Moreover, a child who has always lived with an abusive father won't really see a problem with his relationship with him, since it's the only one he knows, like I said in the video analysis of Denji and Chainsaw Man. But then, at the age of 11, Guts will gradually start to ask himself questions, which is normal, he's growing up, and will eventually conclude that the only thing he has to worry about is surviving the next day, killing people to earn money, and going on and on. At least that's what he forces himself to think about, so he doesn't have to think about his relationship with Gambino. But that's precisely when Gambino, in a drunken stupor, shows up in his tent and tries to kill him. Gambino holds Guts responsible for the death of Sis, his wife, whom he's been thinking about all this time despite his insensitive appearance. He believes that Guts is cursed and responsible for all his misfortunes. In fact, he's only looking for a meaning, a cause for his misfortune, so that he can direct his anger against something specific and avoid facing up to his pain and the reality of the world in which he lives, an absurd world of suffering. In this sense, he's perfectly in tune with Idea's description of humanity in the deleted chapter, which I discussed at length in the previous video on God, causality and free will. But anyway, he'll tell him that he should have died before attacking him, and after Guts dodges him, he'll finally reveal that it was he who sold him to Donovan. And that's when everything Guts didn't want to believe in, everything he'd pushed from his thoughts by using his sword, comes rushing back to him. And just as the bond with the man he considers his father has been completely broken by the latter as he prepares to kill him, Guts, in a mixture of sadness and despair, instinctively defends himself and kills Gambino without really meaning to, as if the sword had a will of its own to protect him. And even afterwards, when the mercenary troop pursues him, pierces him with an arrow and knocks him off a cliff, leaving him for dead with no energy left, the sword remains glued to his hand. And it will save him again when he's attacked by wolves just afterwards, killing them until they flee, even though Guts seemed to have given up on everything at that point. In short, the sword is an extremely important concept for Guts, and we'll be talking about it again later in the video. Moreover, this passage with the wolves shows us one of Guts' main characteristics. He's a survivor at all costs. Even if he finds it completely absurd, even if he gives up and thinks he's ready to die, his survival instinct remains too strong and will always prevail. And his birth is the best example of this kind of innate gift, where we saw Guts manage to survive on his own in a puddle for some time after he was born. And sometimes it's almost as if he survives against his will, as we saw with the wolves, but also when Gambino tried to kill him and told him he should have died under his mother's corpse, and that his words seemed to resonate as truth with Guts. We'll come back to this in a moment too, but Guts himself will come to wonder why he's so determined to survive in the end, what it is that holds him so tightly to life, and above all, what meaning his life can possibly have. Another major characteristic of Guts that his childhood highlights is his ability to use his rage as both a weapon and a shield. When he trains with Gambino, it's his rage that enables him to hurt him. When he gets raped, it's his rage that enables him to try, in vain, to free himself from the trauma by torturing Donovan a little before killing him. When Gambino treats him like a dog, it's out of rage that he'll vent his frustration in his tent, and after killing the few wolves, it's out of rage that he'll get rid of the last ones. In short, it's probably due to the environment of violence and death in which Guts has been immersed since birth, but this characteristic rage has been present since childhood. And it's worth noting that Guts also seems to have a great deal of empathy at heart, as can be seen at age 3 when he insists on staying close to his dying mother when she could give him the plague, but also in his desire to take care of Gambino when he does nothing to make him want to do so. In the end, at the age of 11, Guts emerges from childhood with traumas that have strengthened him to the extreme, both physically and mentally, while closing him off from others, making his life meaningless, where the slightest trace of happiness seems impossible, and rendering him fragile in some of the more intimate aspects of his psychology. This is, in fact, a wounded character, extremely fragile and sensitive, who has been forced to armor himself inside and out to cope with the world in which he lives. But if there's one period in his life when all this becomes clear, it's his adolescence. Guts, after leaving childhood, spent 4 years wandering alone. He lived without attachment to anyone, without the slightest sense of purpose, wandering from battlefield to battlefield without really knowing why, constantly risking his life in a kind of self-destructive quest, without even understanding what it is that ties him to this very life, that makes him cling to it despite everything he's been through. We don't know much about the period between his 11th and 15th years, but there's a flashback in volume 37 that sheds some light on all this. We don't know exactly when this little flashback takes place, but we do know that it takes place before Guts' encounter with the Falcon Troupe, that is before his 15th birthday. In this flashback we see again the questioning I mentioned earlier, where Guts, convinced that he doesn't care whether he lives or dies, knowing he's in a cruel, meaningless world where happiness isn't even an option, can't help but fight to survive. We see this from the very start of the chapter, but also when Guts finds himself imprisoned, and goes so far as to eat a live rat to regain his strength. We also see the consequences of the rape he suffered, when Guts reacts violently when a guy touches him to help him up. We also understand even better his cold and brutal side when he meets the Falcon Troupe, when we see the world in which he grew up, especially with the trust no one aspect that Gambino taught him as a child, and which will inevitably push Guts to always stay alone, to make friends with no one. This advice is reinforced by the mercenary to whom Guts has put a little trust, and who will eventually use him as bait to escape. This flashback also shows us that Guts still attaches a great deal of importance to Gambino, that he still considers him a bit like his real father, that he's almost obsessed with him, but we'll come back to this later. We also see throughout the passage with Quick, the flower spirit, that, as I said earlier, Guts is a character with a great deal of empathy and a certain sensitivity, despite the shell he has had to build to cope with the harshness of the world in which he lives. Finally, this flashback also hints at the discussion he'll have with the old mercenary, which will pull Guts out of his self-destructive quest for meaning, the fact of having comrades in arms who are worth risking their lives for. In short, if this short flashback doesn't seem to teach us anything of capital importance, it subtly shows us the consequences of Guts' terrible childhood, how he continued to shit after killing Gambino, and gives us a better understanding of his state of mind when he met the Falcon's Troupe, and the impact this encounter may have had on him. At the same time, it shows us just how important companionship is to him, echoing, in the context of volume 37, his new companions, and the loss of his past companions from the Falcon Troupe. Anyway, back to the Golden Age. Following on from this flashback, we find Guts at the age of 15, in the middle of battle of course, and we immediately see from his fight against Bazuso that, despite his young age, Guts already possesses extraordinary strength, but also that he takes inordinate risks in battle, as if he didn't care about his chances of survival, something a certain Griffith will notice. And after the battle we'll see in a single page that Guts is obviously still suffering from the trauma of his rape, but also that he refuses the nobleman's offer of comfort and security, and returns to risk his life on the battlefield, again and again. But everything changes right after this battle, when he is attacked by Caucus and other members of the Falcon's Troupe, and ends up meeting Casca, whom he defeats in combat, and then Griffith, against whom he loses instantly. Guts, convalescing after this fight, will relive his rape in a nightmare, with a monstrous version of Donovan, whom he tries in vain to fight, then to flee, and where he will ask for Gambino's help, who will remind him that Guts killed him, and that he almost deserves what happens to him for having done this, with always this phrase coming back and resonating through Guts: "You should have died." This shows us that, despite everything Gambino has said, despite everything he has done to him, and despite his self-defense, Guts can't help but feel guilty about what he has done. This nightmare reminds us that his childhood trauma is twofold: his rape, of course, but also the fact that he killed his own father. Guts wakes up halfway out of this nightmare to see Casca beside him, but doesn't go into his usual hysterics when he's touched, as if transfixed by Casca's eyes, or half rambling, we're not sure. In any case, his traumas seem to subside for a while, which echoes the role Casca will later play when he overcomes his traumas. We'll talk about this later, while suggesting that Guts has had feelings for her from the start. When he wakes up, he more or less gets to know the Falcon Troupe, but especially Griffith, who immediately understands Guts. Indeed, he will hypothesize that Guts is voluntarily exposing himself to death in order to find a reason to live, in order to try to understand why he's so keen to survive deep down, even though he's convinced he doesn't give a damn where or when he dies, as if in constant defiance of his own nature. In short, Griffith puts into words what Guts hasn't really been admitting to himself, which is going to piss him off. This is followed by a second fight, tighter this time, but in which Griffith wins again, making Guts a member of the Falcon Troupe. We can see, however, that Guts doesn't really change his habits, and that, for the moment, even though Griffith intrigues him a lot and he feels indebted to Casca, the only companion he values is none other than his sword, as always, against which he will spend his first night in the troupe, preferring it to his bed. But Griffith will guide this sword towards his enemies, giving Guts a dangerous and vital position in the troupe from his very first battle and showing him his full confidence. Guts, by brilliantly carrying out this mission, will earn the respect of the Falcon's troupe and at the same time will be forcibly integrated into it. There's an important scene from Guts' point of view when Pippin drags him by force to go for a drink. Guts, as usual, freaks out at being touched, but Pippin remains impassive and offers him a drink, supported by the cast members all around him. Guts, a little under the pressure of the group, finally calms down and drinks, before being accosted by a whole host of genuinely benevolent members who compliment him and express their admiration for him, which even shocks him when you look at his facial expressions, for whom everyone was a potential enemy, he who has always learned to keep to himself and be wary of everyone. Of course, he's not going to start questioning himself right away. This doesn't happen overnight, and we can see just afterwards when he looks at Griffith that he's picking himself up and maintaining a dubious attitude, as if to show Griffith that he hadn't yet won on this particular terrain, you might say, by making him change his mind. But he's going to start asking questions all the same. Questions about Griffith first of all, whose strategic genius he has noted, but also about his ambiguity, sometimes childlike, sometimes wise, sometimes frightening. Guts soon understands from talking to Judo that Griffith fascinates people and is a born leader. But also questions about himself. It's not explicit, but it's clear that he's thinking about his own future, his reason for living, even if he distracts himself by just talking about the troupe's atmosphere with Judo. Griffith has rubbed in his face the absurdity of the one thing that kept him returning to combat again and again, the one thing that kept him going. Guts is bound to question himself. Judo understands this, and as if to respond to Guts' introspection, he concludes the discussion by telling him that he's sure he'll find his reason for living among them. This is followed by the famous bath scene, where Guts and Griffith have their water fight, but also and above all where Guts sees Griffith's Baharit for the first time, and where Griffith tells him about his dream of taking possession of his own country. And that's when Guts is really forced to think, because even if he thinks Griffith is completely crazy to have such an inordinate ambition, he's really going to feel tiny compared to Griffith. For a start, Guts is a loner who couldn't rely on anyone, whereas Griffith is surrounded by dedicated men who have total confidence in him. He's a genius strategist, which is something Guts has never tried to be, even though he has great fighting intelligence. And what's more, he's already beaten him in combat on 2 occasions. In short, Griffith's revelation is going to add to all this, and really show Guts that Griffith is superior to him in every way, which is well supported by the composition of the board in this scene, where we have Griffith standing, dominant, bathed in light, and Guts on the ground, dazzled, in a position of inferiority. In short, Guts is about to realize that he hasn't accomplished anything since he killed Gambino and ran away, that all he's done is knowingly put himself in danger and struggle to survive, without even knowing why. And the most interesting thing about this introspection, in my eyes, is that it concludes with the mention of Gambino, as this sheds a little more light on the deeper reason why he's been living like this for the past 4 years. Guts killed Gambino to survive, almost instinctively, when Gambino was screaming at him that he should have died. And since Guts feels guilty about killing him, he tries to understand why he wanted to survive at all costs that day, and so has tirelessly repeated the same pattern for 4 years, risking his life and surviving, as if, by rehearsing that moment when his life was hanging by a thread and his whole being was struggling to keep that thread intact, he would one day come to understand the true meaning of that crucial moment that justifies the fact that he is still alive today, and justifies in passing why he killed Gambino in order to survive, as if to rationalize his crimes, give them meaning, and enable him to overcome the trauma associated with them. Especially since, if his life has no meaning, neither will Gambino's death. In short, by meeting the Falcon's troupe, and Griffith in particular, Guts begins to change little by little, breaking out of the bubble he's created around himself to prevent him from facing up to his own problems and questioning himself, and will finally start to think about his own self. In short, he'll evolve. This introductory sub-arc to the Golden Age concludes with a double-page spread of Guts on horseback, charging into battle under Griffith's orders, as if to show us that thanks to him, he's finally starting to move forward. The chapter that follows this conclusion begins on that famous page that raises the question of causality, which I've already discussed in depth in the previous video, and then takes us 3 years later. Guts is now 18 and still just as tough as ever, though probably even tougher than before. He still gets on just as well with Casca, with whom he's been arguing non-stop for the past 3 years. But there's one thing that's changed and that Guts is aware of. He's no longer the lone wolf he once was. He's fully integrated into the Falcon Troupe and cares about his companions. But we soon see the beginning of a split between Guts and the rest of the Falcon Troupe when Griffith is knighted and made Viscount by the King of Midland in front of the entire Falcon Troupe, and Guts is the only one not to attend, preferring to train with his sword again and again. This is further emphasized by Miura's deliberate decision to end the chapter on a double-page spread at the end, as opposed to the more usual single-page spread, allowing us to conclude on a double-page spread with a dazzling Griffith in full glory, facing his companions and the nobility on one side, and a sweaty Guts alone with his sword on the other. This period, when Griffith truly begins his ascent, is very important in the development of Guts and can be broken down into 6 key scenes, the first of which is the meeting between Guts and Zod. First of all, this is the first time Guts has come face to face with a supernatural, superhuman being, and surely the first time since the end of his childhood that he's been gripped by terror. And with good reason, for not only was Zod, in his human form, the most powerful being he'd ever faced, but Zod was also going to show himself in his bestial apostle form against Guts, reducing his chances of survival to nothing, especially as Zod is one of the most powerful apostles there is. It's a bit like Guts facing the final boss at the start of the game. But the most interesting moment, of course, is when Griffith joins him in battle, risking his life for him, something he wouldn't have done for anyone else, and for which no justification is necessary, according to Griffith, which leads Guts to wonder whether his purpose is to use the sword he holds so dear for Griffith's sake. But Griffith's attitude is going to question Guts quite a bit, and will also impact his relationship with Casca, so it's still worth noting, especially since the Guts-Griffith-Casca triangle is very important in the evolution of the 3 characters, since they influence each other, so we're obliged to talk about it, and I risk repeating myself from video to video, I warn you. The second scene involves the assassination of Julius, the king's brother, who was plotting to eliminate Griffith. If Griffith's risk-taking to save Guts from Zod showed that he cared for him more than anyone else, this mission he gives to Guts also shows us that Guts is the only person to whom Griffith wants to show his dark side. Because yes, he will entrust this assassination to Guts and no one else, and he won't even talk about it to anyone but himself. Guts won't mind, after all, he's used to killing and has no problem with it. But then there's Adonis, Julius's son. Julius treats his son in exactly the same way as Gambino treated Guts, which Guts is going to witness, and which is bound to bring back memories. And when Guts kills Julius, he also unwittingly kills the young Adonis, in a truly heartbreaking scene in which Guts watches the child's agony while holding his hand. Guts identified with Adonis, for he is literally a reflection of Guts as a child, making this scene all the more powerful for him. It's also well supported by another nightmare Guts has, in which he and Gambino are killed by a Zod-like monster, and Guts realizes in the end that the monster is him. All this for Griffith, and this passage is quite important as it leads into the third and probably most important scene of this entire part, the fountain scene. As Guts left to join Griffith in reporting the success of his mission, he surprised him in his discussion with Charlotte, in which Griffith shared his views on the notion of dreams and friendship. For Griffith, what defines a man is his dream. For him, simply living from day to day without a goal to justify one's actions is unacceptable. And that's pretty much what Guts has been doing up to now. And Griffith adds another layer by saying that the members of the Falcon's troop are good comrades on whom he can count, but that he doesn't consider them friends for the simple reason that they don't deal with him as equals, that they're only following his dream, and that a true friend would seek to find his own reason for living, his own dream, and that if anyone, including him, prevented him from realizing this dream, he would fight them. In short, for Griffith, a true friend is someone who is his equal. And this vision profoundly affects Guts at this point, as he realizes that he has only been following Griffith all along, that he is inferior to him, that he is not really his friend. It marks him all the more because, as we saw just before, he had to do the dirty work with Julius's murder and found himself doing something he would never have agreed to do under normal circumstances, killing a child. This feeling of inferiority is really brought out by the composition of the page, where the scenery is obscured to show only Guts and Griffith, with Griffith clearly above Guts, at a distance far too great for him to reach. This page echoes a similar one from the Lost Children arc, but we'll get to that later. Then comes the part where Guts and Casca fall off the cliff and their relationship evolves a little further. Guts will learn about Casca's past and what Griffith means to her, but he'll also learn more about Griffith, and through this, Guts will understand a little better why Casca hates him. I won't necessarily go into detail here, as there's so much to say, but I'll keep these topics under wraps for several other videos. Then comes Guts' famous 1 versus 100 fight against the soldiers of the opposing army, where we can start to see a change in Guts as a result of the previous scenes. For example, Guts will tell Casca to go and find the person to whom she has dedicated her sword, Griffith, as if this were not the case for him, as if his sword belonged only to him. whereas just a few days before, he was ready to do as Casca had done. In fact, Guts doesn't even stay to fight to protect Casca, or to help Griffith in any way, but simply for himself, because he's only good at making his sword fly in all directions, as he says, that in the end, his real reason for living was perhaps just that, to fight again and again. In any case, he derives real pleasure from it. These moments when he risks his life and pushes his body beyond its limits are like a trance for him. They really make him feel alive, a bit like an extreme sportsman or a bit like a Berserk. But he knows that deep down the meaning of his life can't just be found in this sensation of enjoyment where endorphin and adrenaline mix, and that it's all a bit ridiculous in the end. That if there's a meaning behind all this, it's probably deeper than that. The fifth scene is the famous campfire scene. In this discussion with Casca, Guts talks a little about his concerns on this subject. He sees himself as less good than everyone else, that even if he kills 100 or 1000 guys, he can't do any more than that. He makes a comparison with the troops' campfire that I really like. Each fire represents everyone's little dreams, like a dream fireplace, which come together to form a huge blaze, Griffith's big dream. Guts, on the other hand, is just a traveller who's come to warm up around this fire for a while. He's not part of it. Warming by the fire was nice, but he stayed there too long and did nothing but feed it to keep warm. He did nothing but fight for someone else, for Griffith, taking simple pleasure in the fight. But he wants to be Griffith's friend, to be his equal, and so refuses to let his dream be just one of the fires feeding the huge blaze that is Griffith's dream. This leads him to have no dream at all, just to live aimlessly from one day to the next, simply satisfying his thirst for combat, something Griffith considers unacceptable. And so we come to the only possible conclusion for Guts. He must leave the Falcon Troupe and find his own dream, his own reason for living. After defeating Boscogne, taking Doldry and ending the 100-year war against the Tudor, Guts will have completed his last battle for the Falcon Troupe. He will, however, have one last mission to accomplish with Griffith's little plot to assassinate the Queen of Midland, his last enemy at court. So having disposed of his enemies on the battlefield, and those within with these assassinations, Guts has finally completed his role within the troupe, and will decide, a month later, to leave the troupe. Now that he's had his fill, now that Griffith has made him aware of the emptiness of his existence, he wants to rectify this to become his equal, his friend. After that, we also have a discussion with Judo on the thorny subject of Casca, and a bit about the love triangle between her, Guts and Griffith, but I'll save that for another video. Anyway, Guts makes it clear that he has feelings for Casca, but that he's not going to take her with him, that he doesn't even dare offer her anything, because he thinks he doesn't stand a chance against Griffith in this respect. Once again, Griffith is superior to him. Then comes the mythical fight between Guts and Griffith, the third one, with Griffith refusing to let Guts leave the troupe. Guts confronts him in the only area where he has a chance against him, the only area where he thinks he can deal with him as an equal, a fight. The stakes in this fight are enormous for Guts, not because his freedom is at stake here, but because defeat would mean that he would forever be inferior to Griffith, that he would never be able to pursue his own dream, that he could never be considered by Griffith as a true friend. To become one, Guts must defeat Griffith. And that's where the drama of the whole Berserk story lies. Guts never understood what he really meant to Griffith, never understood that he was more than a friend to him, and that's what's going to trigger his descent into hell and lead to the eclipse. But we'll do a whole part of a video just on this subject, because a lot of people have completely missed the point, or just don't want to admit it. I have a feeling it'll be quite controversial. But anyway, this fight will be settled in a fraction of a second, during which Guts will crush Griffith with his brute strength, the strength he has developed on the battlefield during his 3 years in his service. For the first time, Guts outclassed Griffith in one area. For the first time, Griffith lost, and Guts will go, leaving the troupe and Casca behind, not looking back, confident that Griffith will rise again without a hitch, seeing himself mistakenly as a mere stone in his path, insignificant in the face of the greatness of his dream. After his departure, Guts spends his nights alone for the first time in 3 years and questions his choice, wondering whether he's really acting of his own free will or whether he's just been stupidly influenced by Griffith, since Guts' idea of friendship, which is the basis of his choice, comes from Griffith. He also meets the Skull Knight for the first time, who prophesies the eclipse for him, like Zod, and whom I've already mentioned in the previous video. But anyway, Guts is going to spend a year as a hermit in a mountain to train as a swordsman, and to question himself on what should be his goal, the meaning of his life. It's also here that he meets Godo and Erika, and it's partly thanks to Godo, for whom being a blacksmith has been his whole life, and who has found a meaning to his life through it, captivated by the sparks that occur when he forges, which he compares to life itself, that Guts will start to get some good leads on this questioning, for it is these same sparks that occur when two swords collide and their owners put their lives on the line. We're back to everything I said in the part about Guts' childhood, but for him, the sword is life, It's what's enabled him to survive all this time. Everything he's experienced, he's lived through it, to the point where he even imagines that he was born for the sword. His dream is to continue to wield his sword, to control it freely, because he lives through it, and by controlling it fully, he controls his life, and thus becomes truly free. In short, his dream will be to remove himself from all influence with the help of his sword, and forge his own future through it. Where Griffith has a purely material dream, his kingdom, Guts has found a more spiritual dream, more metaphysical one might say. And all this ties in once again with the previous video on causality and one of the manga's main issues. Leaving his mountain to put his training into practice, he takes part in a tournament where he meets Shihat for the first time, beats him, and then learns that the Falcon's Troupe is being hunted. After tracking him down, beating Shihat in the process, and more or less saving the troop, Guts meets up with Casca and his former companions, who explain everything that's happened, their year spent surviving as best they can, and most importantly, that they've hatched a plan to break Griffith out. And then comes one of the best scenes in the whole manga for me, the waterfall scene. Guts finds an exhausted Casca, who has had to take it upon herself to save what's left of the troop for a whole year, and who seems to be the only one who really understands the reasons for Griffith's actions which led the troop straight into this situation. In short, she's the only one who knows that everything happened because of Guts' departure, and she returns all her frustration when she finds him, a Guts who still doesn't understand the way Griffith saw him, who doesn't understand how behaving like a true friend could have bothered him. In short, he's lost. Casca lets loose and confesses all that's in her heart about Griffith and the end of her own dream, more on that in another video again, and completely gives up. Caught up by Guts, she finally admits to herself her feelings for him, which Guts has long shared, and they kiss. But we're more interested in what happens next, the sex, in those chapters cleverly named wounds. Because yes, this is an extremely important moment for Guts. While he's sleeping with Casca, his childhood traumas linked to his rape by Donovan and the murder of Gambino will resurface, and he'll start strangling her, seeing through her the child he once was, and this time taking the place of the aggressor. Then he'll go completely off the rails, start talking to Gambino, apologizing for killing him. He'll talk about his rape, how he killed his rapist right afterwards, and so on. Casca will try to help him in his delirium, and that's how he'll finally confess to someone all his traumas, all the wounds that have made him suffer inside for all these years, and that he'd always kept silent about, all that fragility well hidden behind the shell he'd forged for himself. Casca, who had already confessed all his weaknesses to him and now knew his own, would come to comfort him, and as they drifted off to sleep, Guts would recall the moment when, as a child, he had applied to himself the remedy Gambino had given him, the only time in his entire childhood when his father had offered him affection, as if everything he had ever done to him was now behind him, as if Casca had just brought out all the little happiness he had known as a child, just as she had calmed his nightmare when she slept with Guts to warm him just after their first meeting. In short, thanks to Casca, Guts has finally rid himself of his childhood traumas and healed his wounds. After that, Guts will be in a kind of culmination in terms of development, his dark past and traumas finally overcome, his feelings confessed to Casca and shared by her, his reason for living becoming clearer, all while being stronger than ever, surrounded by his companions and preparing to rescue the one he can now consider his equal. Everything shows us that he's one step away from bliss. He's like an accomplished hero preparing, with Griffith's rescue, to triumph over his ultimate test. Once again, this is in stark contrast to Griffith, who is literally at rock bottom and has lost everything. But as they say, and as Griffith found out, the higher you go, the harder the fall. When he wakes up after explaining his dream to Casca, Guts makes it clear once again that he has no intention of staying with the Falcon Troupe, but this time offers Casca the chance to follow him. This is followed by Griffith's rescue, where Guts finds his friend in the worst state imaginable, and shows the strength he's acquired over a year of training by letting his rage explode. After battling the Bakiraka and Wild on the run, showing in the process that he can survive against an apostle, Guts and the rest of the troop find themselves completely lost. While Griffith's rescue is a success, he can no longer walk or even talk. In fact, he can't do anything at all, and they're all completely lost. They don't know what to do. They all have to make a choice between leaving the troop and following their own goals, or staying to look after Griffith, especially Guts, especially as there's also the question of Casca to consider. But it's his old companions who make him realize that he belongs here after all, and that leaving them was a mistake. Then comes the eclipse, and as Guts struggles to return to Griffith, the latter offers him up as a sacrifice to become God Hand and fulfill his dream. Guts refuses to believe it, or at least takes a long time to realize it. He will, as is often the case, fight frenetically just so he doesn't have to think, just so he doesn't have to realize that deep down he knows that Griffith could very well have made this choice. Then he gradually sinks into despair as he falls into a pond of blood and sees all the corpses in the troop. Gaston will die in front of him by having his skull blown off. He'll find Pippin's corpse devoured from the inside. He'll see a whole bunch of members of the troupe dead in an atrocious manner, apostles everywhere in a scene that has all the makings of a real nightmare. And above all, he'll find Casca, alive but about to be raped. And just as he's about to freak out and charge into the crowd before being overpowered by an apostle, Griffith, or rather Femto, shows up and rape Casca right in front of him. And then there'll be no doubt about Griffith. Guts will rip off his arm to free himself and attack him, but will just get overpowered again and lose an eye whose last vision will be that of Casca lying on the ground, completely broken mentally by the rape that Griffith, the man who was once his friend, has put him through. I'm not going to dwell too much on this, because if there's one thing Berserk readers have remembered and discussed, it's the eclipse. But the trauma that comes out of such an event, whether for Guts or Casca for that matter, is unimaginable. We'll come back to Casca in another video, but for Guts alone, we have a character who was truly accomplished, as I detailed earlier, and now everything he held dear has just collapsed. All his companions are dead, his best friend has betrayed him by sacrificing them and raping his wife, bringing out his childhood traumas in the process, and as if that weren't enough, the curse that Griffith has imposed on him is going to prevent him from living serenely, because every night monsters will come to attack him. On top of all this, Casca has gone mad. And to cope with all this, Guts could find nothing but blind hatred and violence. One of the best examples of this is the birth of the cursed child. After having sex, unknowingly, Casca was pregnant with Guts' child. But this child was somehow contaminated by Griffith's rape in his god hand form, and became a kind of demon. Guts' first reaction is to try and kill this cursed child. And indeed, he will continue throughout the next arcs to hate this child, his child, who will regularly appear alongside him. More on that later. And this is where Miura's real stroke of writing genius comes in. Guts, blinded by hatred, will treat his son in exactly the same way as Gambino treated himself. He will regard this child as cursed, as one of those responsible for all the bad things that have happened to him, the death of his companions and Casca's madness, just as Gambino accused Guts of being cursed and responsible for Sis's death. And just like Gambino with him, he will want to kill his own son. So it's these two childhood traumas that will indirectly resurface because of the eclipse, the rape through Casca, and his toxic father-son relationship. And then finally, at the end of this long flashback, and after 35 minutes of video, we have the answer to the question posed in the introduction. What could Guts have suffered to be driven by such ferocious hatred? Well, it's all this. A horrific childhood that he heroically faced and overcame with the help of his companions, in order to elevate himself and become an accomplished man, only to lose it all and plunge back into absolute horror. If Guts emerges from the eclipse completely broken mentally, he has at the same time become a monster physically, a veritable killing machine. It's not just Guts' madness during the Black Swordman arc that takes on its full meaning, but also his exceptional physical strength. In fact, as Miura pointed out in an interview, Guts' physical capabilities as an adult are completely unrealistic. In our world, no human being, no matter what his background or genetics, can have such strength. A guy who lives the same life as Guts is mostly going to end up with a herniated disc and fucked up joints in real life. But first of all, Miura's aim isn't to be realistic. This is a fantasy manga after all. But also, these abilities become almost believable once we know everything about his past, as we've been able to follow him from birth and see him struggle to survive throughout his life, facing very difficult physical and even desperate times, giving him an extremely strong will, an extremely strong mind, coupled with uncommon physical strength. Add to all this the mythical dragon slayer that Godot forged long ago, and that no one has ever known how to wield, as well as a metal prosthesis that doubles as a cannon. Add to that years of combat experience and a visceral hatred, and you've got yourself a true apostle-killing monster, the Black Swordman. And so we return to Volume 1, which takes place 2 years after the eclipse, chronologically speaking. Yes, I warned you it was going to be long. So, as a reminder, Miura had no idea of Guts' past in these first volumes, so there are certain passages that we may find a little inconsistent now that we know Guts' past, such as the first pages when he has sex with an apostle in order to kill her, where we may wonder if he's gone so crazy as to do such a thing just for revenge, especially knowing his traumas with sex. But it's still impressive to see how consistent the Guts we're shown is with his past, even though this consistency was completely improvised. We see an extremely cold Guts, individualistic to the core, who will finally start saying out loud what Griffith thought out quiet during the Golden Age, namely that only his personal desires count and that the weak should just die. A phrase he utters in a mixture of anger, sadness and terror, as if he's trying to rationalize Griffith's choice, to put himself in his enemy's shoes, to ape him so as to get at him more easily, or to create a kind of mental shield, repeating this kind of phrase to himself so as not to have to feel guilty about his actions, to manage to hold out and keep this attitude so contrary to his deepest nature. it will also be the return of his hysterical outbursts as soon as he's touched. In short, the character of Guts has regressed. He's gone back to being a traumatized child, a loner who doesn't trust anyone, a lost child you might say, with a visceral hatred that drives him half mad. But he can't completely hide what he really is. For example, he'll allow himself to be stabbed by the demon-possessed and already dead Colette, and vomit after decapitating her, just as the murder of little Adonis revolted him. It wouldn't be surprising in fact if Miura had thought up the scene with Adonis in the Golden Age in part to reinforce its coherence. Also, another super interesting point for me in this arc is the relationship between Guts and Vulgus. Vulgus is a bit like Guts. His wife and children were tortured and killed before his eyes by the Slug Apostle, and he too will end up maimed and amputated, but will survive, and dedicate his life to one thing, his revenge, an absurd revenge, they always are, and desperate, against an enemy far too strong for him, just like Guts with the God Hand. And while Guts will pretend to be repulsed by Vulgus and his weakness, in reality, it's just a defense mechanism against becoming attached to him, because he's afraid. He recognizes himself in Vulgus, while being able to look critically at his actions because he has an outside viewpoint. It's as if he can see the absurdity of his own quest in front of him. That's what scares him, because this quest for revenge is all he has left. If he gives up on it, if he realizes it's futile, he'll collapse completely, he'll have nothing left to drive him forward. And we have Puck to thank for understanding this and telling him so to his face. Yes, Puck is the character who saves Guts in this part of the manga, as Rickert will point out a little later. We can also see the compassion Guts feels for Vulgus when he goes to see his decapitated head. Oh, and another noteworthy detail. It was thanks to Vulgus that Guts recovered the Beherit from the account, which he still possesses today, and which one suspects will serve as Chekhov's gun. But what I find most interesting are the battles between Guts and the Apostles, in which Guts becomes a real monster. We already see a bit of this in Volume 1 against the Snake Apostle, but it's particularly noticeable against the Slug Apostle, where Guts is going to be so monstrous that he ends up being much scarier than the monster he's hunting. By torturing the Slug Apostle in front of his daughter, taking unhealthy pleasure in it, laughing like a madman, you almost feel empathy for the Apostle. All the more so as he becomes increasingly human as the battle progresses, showing genuine love for his daughter, culminating in his flashback, and above all, his refusal to sacrifice Theresia, preferring to condemn himself to eternal hell. In short, Guts' hatred has driven him so mad that he's even worse than the monsters he hunts, and his brief confrontation with Griffith doesn't help matters. Also of note is his relationship with Theresia, whom he advises to commit suicide to play the tough guy, but who ultimately saves his life just as she's about to fall, reminding him that he can't lie to himself and shut out the empathy he naturally feels, especially towards children. And finally, to help her hold on, he'll give her the only thing he's capable of giving her, hate. Hatred as the only way to move forward, because it's all he knows, it's the only answer he's found. And if he's crying, it's because he's just led an innocent child down the same path as himself, and he knows from his own experience that the result will be nothing more than suffering for her. Which brings us back to Volume 14, with the arc of the Lost Children, where Guts will face a similar situation, but where the conclusion will not be the same. This time, he'll meet Jill, for whom, as usual with children, he'll have a great deal of empathy, as we can see when she falls asleep on him and he's about to wake her up. But he finally lets her sleep after seeing the bruises her father inflicted on her by hitting her, which echo his own childhood. We can also see this with the village's other random child, whom he will use as bait and for whom he will burn the fake elves who killed his parents. But he sees this empathy as a weakness and does everything in his power to drive it out, forcing himself to be constantly unpleasant and feign indifference to Jill's fate. In general, Guts rejects any connection with others, as we also see in his relationship with Puck, whom he will constantly ask to get out of the way, not least because he exacerbates Guts' empathy by interfering in everything and anything. But he'll soon see that isolating himself completely and refusing help from anyone can only lead to a dead end, and there's a scene that's quite eloquent on this subject. It's when Guts, while sleep deprived, wounded all over, and even a little poisoned, physically tired from all the fighting he's just done, knows he's not going to be able to go on much longer in this state, and just when he's not sure what to do, he's finally saved by the elf powder that Puck has sprinkled in his bag. But he's stubborn and, in general, spends the arc trying to forget all empathy, all feelings other than his hatred for the Apostles and his murderous desires, convinced as he is that allowing any other feeling to express itself would only weaken him. For this time, the Apostle he must kill is also a child, all the more so since Jill has told him Rosine's story, a story of an unhappy childhood once again. That's why Guts repeatedly misses Rosine when he could have killed her under normal circumstances. This fight is a real battle against himself, fighting against what little humanity he has left, seeking to plunge himself completely into the purest hatred, making him the true monster of this arc. Never has Guts been more frightening than here. We see him lashing out again and again using methods each more extreme than the last, burning the kids turned into elves, dousing himself in their own blood so as not to burn with it, using Jill as bait to attack Rosine, etc. This fight is truly a concentration of pure madness, while at the same time Rosine becomes increasingly humanized. And this reversal between the human becoming monstrous and the monster becoming more human reaches its climax when Rosine, after we've seen her tragic flashback, finds herself on the brink of death with Jill by her side, where we have a really strong and touching discussion, offering her an ending as beautiful as it is tragic, but which will be interrupted by an enraged Guts, who doesn't even seem to be aware of what's going on anymore, completely lost in his blind anger. In the end, he'll be interrupted by Farnese and Serpico's troop chasing him, but he's very close to finishing off Rosine and killing Jill in the process. At the end of the arc, Guts refuses to allow Jill to accompany him into the darkness. As if he'd realized that hatred had taken him too far this time, he didn't want to act in the same way as with Theresia, preferring to keep Jill away from his world. When he tells her, "Where you run away, there's no paradise," he's speaking from experience, for he himself ran away from the only things he had left. Rickert, Godo and Erika of course, but above all, Casca. All this to end up living in darkness in this dumping ground for losers, as he puts it. Far from paradise indeed. And that brings us to another ultra-important scene in this arc, the scene where his son, the cursed child, comes to visit him. Guts, in the 2 years he has spent immersed in hatred, seems to have completely forgotten Casca, and the cursed child, who continues to watch over her, tries to warn him that she has left Godo's cave. Now, as the Skull Knight said, demon children honor their parent as their demon nature allows. So the cursed child will communicate in the only way he can, by possessing the ghosts of the children transformed into false elves that Guts had just killed. Ghosts that keep repeating "mommy, mommy." But in reality, it's the cursed child who, through these children, is trying to remind Guts of the existence of his mother, Casca, so that he returns to her and saves her from the danger she's in, which Guts doesn't understand, preferring to see it as an attack by the cursed child, a way of making him suffer even more. This brings us back to the Guts-Gambino relationship, where Guts made every effort to please Gambino, but Gambino was completely blind to his gestures, obsessed by his hatred for him. Leaving the Valley of the Mists, Guts will find himself invaded by minor evil spirits, the kind that get into people's brains to bring out the darkest aspects of their personality, and these will make him feel guilty for killing children simply to maintain his fighting frenzy, while tempting him to abandon all humanity and plunge him totally into hatred. This is the first appearance of the beast that sleeps in Guts, a metaphor for his own madness. But the most interesting part of this passage, in my eyes, is the square that focuses on Guts' Beherit, followed by the beast telling him that this way, he'll finally be able to become like his friend, like Griffith. It's a dialogue that reveals a lot about Guts' innermost thoughts, and we'll come back to it later. In any case, it's clear that at this point he's obsessed with Griffith and forgets everything else. However, there's an evolution that will be salutary. If the demons keep telling him to stay alone, always alone, Guts finally takes his first step towards others with Puck, whom he calls by his first name for the first time, as if to symbolize the fact that he's accepting him for good at his side, whereas up to now he's only rejected him, just as he rejected almost everyone else. After that, he's captured by Farnese's troop, and we get to see his rather salty take on religion, which makes perfect sense, given that, unlike almost every other human being on Earth, he got a glimpse of what God was really like with the God Hand. And given everything that's come of it, you can imagine how hard it is for him to hear that a benevolent God is watching over us. But more than religion itself, it's the whole mechanism of dogmatic belief that's repugnant to him. The fact of believing in something without foundation, and basing one's whole life on it, using it to justify all his actions, even the most cruel, something he's already experienced in the past as a mercenary. We can talk more about this in a video on Farnese, but I think I'll also do a video on Berserk and religion, as many people seem to think that Berserk has a very anti-religious message, whereas it's actually more nuanced than that. But anyway, a few demons and a rapist horse later, and Guts will once again fall back into his frenzied rage by slaying demons. Then the cursed child will once again warn Guts of the danger Casca faces by giving him a nightmare, giving him a clue as to where she's headed. Moreover, we can assume that the cursed child has been protecting Casca every night from evil spirits, but is clearly calling Guts for help, as this time the danger will be human. Guts finally understands this and returns to Godo, where he learns that Casca disappeared a month ago. And just as Guts is about to berate Rickert, it's a child Erika, who reminds him that he's the one who screwed up in the first place, abandoning Casca to go kill apostles. This is followed by Godo's sermon, which is one of my favorite dialogues in the manga, in which he explains to Guts that plunging into hatred is just a way of escaping, of not having to face suffering, but that it's just a destructive vicious circle, because it only brings more suffering, which we'll try to hide with more hatred, etc. And then Guts will tell him that all this talk is all very well, but that it's easy to say when you've lived a quiet life, and that no one is capable of imagining the full horror of the eclipse. And that's precisely where Guts is wrong. There is one person, and it's Casca. Godo tells him, "You left the only person you had left after being saved from this hell on that famous day 2 years ago, and you went off on your own. Without staying by the side of the only person irreplaceable to you, and without sharing and overcoming this pain together. All alone, consumed in your hatred, you escaped. When the going gets tough, you always choose to be alone, you always choose war. You're a sword on a battlefield full of cracks covered in blood and rust. You're a sword broken by a fatal crack." That says it all. Everything that Guts had managed to do before the eclipse, that is, come out of his voluntary solitude and face his traumas to overcome them, notably thanks to his companions and especially thanks to Casca, he hasn't been able to do after the eclipse. That's why I said the character had regressed earlier, and Guts is finally going to realize it. In addition, Rickert, whom he had just yelled at, has evolved unlike him by mourning the loss of his companions and building the Hill of Swords as a tribute to them. Guts finds himself in the midst of introspection, balancing his hatred with the preservation of what's left to him. And that's how he'll realize he's made the same mistake he made when he left the Falcon Troupe. He left what he valued most to go it alone, and didn't realize its value until after he'd lost it. Except that this time it's not too late and he can still make up for it. He can still save Casca. So he sets off, meeting Isidro along the way, for whom he feels a little affection, but above all the Skull Knight, who tells him that an occultation is brewing and reminds him that humans are powerless against the God Hand, against causality. To which Guts replies that he'd already been told the same thing about the eclipse, and that he and Casca were still alive. The Skull Knight leaves on a hopeful note, telling him that he may not be a reflection on the water, but a fish swimming on its surface. Once again, I refer you to the causality video for all this. But anyway, there's a lot to say about this arc that doesn't concern Guts directly, so I'm going to skip a lot of stuff, but basically there are stylish fights. Guts is going to find Casca, notably thanks to the help of Isidro and the prostitutes. Stylish fight against Serpico. She's going to get captured again. Stylish fight against Mozgus's minions, then against Mozgus himself, and rescue of Casca before she gets burned by the people. What's important to remember here is that this time it's not Guts alone who saves Casca and survives the occultation, but the collective action of a whole host of characters, from Guts' future companions Isidro, Serpico and Farnese, to secondary characters such as the prostitutes, Jerome, the guy who wanted to make Luca his mistress, and the cursed child. In short, it was by accepting and trusting the help of others that Guts was able to save Casca. He's finally been able to put his loneliness aside, as he did in the Golden Age when he joined the Falcon Troupe, even if there's still some work to be done on the sociability front. Finally, this arc concludes with a final dilemma for Guts, the choice between hatred, Griffith, and love, Casca. For Griffith comes face to face with him, in human guise no less. He's finally here, the man he's been looking for 2 years, and who was completely unreachable. His revenge is at hand. However, the moment he saw Griffith in human form, and not Griffith the God Hand, for a moment, all those murderous desires vanished, as if the Griffith in front of him was the old Griffith, the one who had been his friend. But after recovering from this shock, his hatred resurfaced. And just as he was about to pounce on him, Casca's voice stopped him dead in his tracks, and he finally decided to choose her and run away to protect her. Just for the record, Guts' age is now an approximation. The timeline is pretty fuzzy, but all we know is that he was 21 in the Conviction arc, and will be 24 in volume 38 when he arrives on Skellig, according to the guidebook. It's just a detail, but there it is, now you know. This long new arc begins with the famous scene on Sword Hill, where Guts and Griffith confront each other, or rather Guts and Zod, since Griffith, though human, still seems as unattainable as ever. But anyway, it's finally time for Guts and Griffith to face off. Right from the start, Griffith will, exactly as he did when they first met, analyze Guts with relevance, telling him not that he hasn't changed, but that he behaves as he did when they first met, supporting the fact that Guts has regressed. The parallel with that time is quite blatant, with Griffith seeming so far above Guts that he's completely detached from the scene, extremely serene. And when Guts asks him if he feels nothing for those he has betrayed, Griffith simply replies that he has never betrayed his dream, the only thing that ever mattered to him, well, apart from Guts. And it was precisely to see if Guts could disturb him as before that he returned to see him. This time, however, Griffith is free of this hindrance, and nothing can stand between him and his dream. Well, not quite, as you know. Then comes the fight against Zod, which shows just how superpowered Guts has become, who only 3 years ago was smashed with Griffith by the same Zod, and is now able to face him. But that still won't be enough, as Griffith leaves, taken away by Zod, and reminding Guts that nothing has changed, and that Guts knew very well what kind of man Griffith was, only he knew. After that, he explains to Rickert what happened during the eclipse, while refusing to let him follow him, and wonders what to do next. He mustn't abandon Casca, but can't take her with him on his quest for revenge, now that it's finally becoming a reality. In short, he's in a dilemma, especially as Goro's cave has been destroyed and they're nowhere safe because of the mark. And that's when Puck comes up with the idea of going home, to the island of the elves. So Guts has finally found a new goal, putting aside his quest for revenge, but it won't be easy. First of all, he's going to realize that fighting while protecting someone is nothing like fighting alone, without really having to worry about the state you're going to end up in. But it's above all the fact of living daily with this broken Casca, who is a shadow of her former self, that is the hardest part for Guts. It's really terrible for him to see her reduced to a kind of damsel in distress to be protected, even an animal in distress at times, when in normal circumstances she should have been fighting by his side, giving him orders and supporting him morally. In fact, she's not really Casca anymore, but just a thing with her looks, because it's cognition that defines what a person is, not their physical appearance. At any rate, it's a thought that runs through Guts, and is exacerbated by the beast within him, which resurfaces in a nightmare caused by an incubus. It tells him to abandon her, and take his revenge instead. That in the end, Guts couldn't care less about this parody of Casca, that she's nothing more than a tool to keep him from forgetting the suffering Griffith has caused him, like an offering, a sacrifice feeding his hatred. Then he concludes with a terrible thought, to do to Casca what Griffith did to him, so that he can get a little closer to him, as the beast had already said after the Ark of the Lost Children. And while Guts will try to persuade himself that this thought couldn't possibly have come from him, deep down he'll know that these kinds of thoughts do cross his mind, and will become increasingly afraid of himself. In yet another battle with demons, he will become possessed and assault Casca, and if Puck will try to reassure him that it's just due to demon possession, Guts knows it's not just that. And this will cause him even more suffering, because Casca will hate him and try to run away from him, so he'll be forced to tie her up like a wild beast. It's a truly terrible period when Guts is pushed to the limit physically, given the difficulty of fighting while protecting Casca, but also morally, with a Casca with whom he can't even communicate a little, who hates him, and whom he has to watch over constantly. All this while being afraid of himself, constantly on guard against his own dark thoughts. He realizes that saving her like a hero saves the damsel in distress won't make everything better, that it can't erase all the time he's left her alone. And then there's going to come a day when all that accumulated mental load is too much to bear, and Guts goes completely crazy. After Casca runs off and kills some bandits looking to rape her, Guts is going to find her and is going to start raping her, the beast resurfacing and drawing on his childhood traumas, making him someone for whom sex is a violent thing in itself. He'll go so far as to bite her breast until she bleeds, the beast telling him, "Lacerate her like Griffith did, devour it, pierce it, it's a sacrificial offering, you must lose everything, everything must feed your hatred." And the most important thing about this scene is that it takes place in broad daylight, that this time Guts hasn't been possessed by some demon, but that he and he alone has acted like this, and it's really terrible because Guts knows he's just made Casca relive the trauma she suffered during the eclipse, and we can even suggest that this action will have a huge impact on the plot later on, but we'll talk more about that towards the end of the video. In short, it's all a mess. He has failed in this fight against himself and knows that the situation has become untenable. But an unexpected solution comes just around the corner with the arrival of Farnese, Serpico and Isidro. Guts will have to reluctantly accept the help of the others in order to protect Casca from the demons, but above all from himself, for as he says, he's stunned by his own powerlessness. In short, he's going to find new companions. And Guts will gradually open up to these new companions, letting Farnese take care of Casca, training Isidro, letting Serpico assist him in battle, even though he knows that their relationship remains very strained, and in exchange, he will distance himself a little from Casca, for fear of hurting her again, for fear that the beast will resurface. As he says, it's better for someone else to save you, because all I can do is destroy you, always with the beast in the background. Then comes the meeting with Shirke and Flora, where he learns more about a lot of things, from Griffith's actions to the Beherits, and the very nature of the world he lives in. It's a bit of a lore point, really. And again, it's a part I talked about quite a bit in the causality video. But anyway, the battles he'll do in the village and in the Clifford will strengthen his ties with this new group, whom he'll finally accept as his companions. But just as Guts seems to be gradually rediscovering a bit of the man he once was during the Golden Age, the group also helping him to avoid giving into madness and leaving the beast within him lurking in the shadows, Miura will revive the plot with the Berserker armor, which while serving as a much needed power-up for Guts, given the army of apostles he'll have to face, will also have the side effect of exacerbating the beast within him, causing his rage to explode and making him forget everything else, turning him into a true berserk, all the while inflicting considerable damage on his own body. This power-up is ultimately like a big sword of Damocles pointing at Guts, ready to fall at the slightest mistake. But in the end, Guts will still manage to get away with the Berserker armor thanks to the others, especially Shirka, showing us once again that cooperation is the key to fighting madness, and that solitude can only lead to his own destruction. Oh, and his companions will also be able to help him heal his wounds, whereas without them, Guts would probably have succumbed to them, and even if he had managed on his own, that would have left a whole period where he couldn't have protected Casca, and would have been vulnerable himself. Guts will gradually become more and more appeased, whether thanks to Flora's protection, which will keep the demons away at night and enable him to sleep in safety at last, or simply thanks to his companions who will make Casca happier. I really like the scene where the group arrives at the sea. It's a magnificent double-page spread, in which Casca's childlike joy and Guts' appeasement can be felt, echoing the scene in which Guts wondered when he accepted the others as his companion, when the last time Casca had smiled was. This scene is almost like a reward for Guts to have been able to trust others again after the terrible betrayal he experienced, and to have been able to put aside his hatred, even his obsession with Griffith. And with this appeasement also comes a note of hope, as the Skull Knight tells him that the Elf King may well be able to restore Casca's sanity. However, he warns him about two things: the impact of the Berserker's armor on his body, and the fact that Casca herself may not wish to come to her senses, given the extent of her trauma. We also note the first appearance of the Moonchild, who is none other than the Cursed Child, Guts and Casca's son, who served as Griffith's bodily envelope for his resurrection, and who takes control of Griffith's body on the nights of the full moon. Guts doesn't know it, of course, but his presence will remind him of the Cursed Child, his son, and for the first time he will empathize with him, wondering where he is now, thus breaking the unhealthy father-son relationship he had with him, and which he derived from his own relationship with Gambino. And it's worth noting that the Moonchild does him a favor right afterwards by preventing him from sinking completely because of the Berserker's armor. In short, Guts has one more reason to go to Skellig, and that's why he has to go and get a boat from Vritanis, where he has to deal with the dissensions of his new group, Shirka, who's going to feel uncomfortable in town, and Farnese, who, under pressure from his family, is going to be somewhat forced to leave Guts' group. And each time, Guts will take care of them, proving that he really cares about these new companions from now on. But it's Serpico who's going to create the most dissension, wanting to keep Farnese out of the group for fear that Guts will end up killing her because of the Berserker's armor. This gives Guts a real added weight in his fight against the beast, because now that he has companions he cares about, it's not just Casca he has to protect from himself. We can also see that Guts is gradually abandoning the idea of confronting Griffith, as we can see when he meets Owen, who recognizes him since he saw him several times during the Golden Age. The latter will ask him where Griffith is, and Guts will make it clear after a little hesitation that he doesn't want to know. What matters to him is to restore Casca's sanity. For revenge he'll think about later. And this is symbolized very well by the pages where Guts leaves the mainland to take the boat towards Skellig, after having fought Ganishka with Zod and abused the Berserker armor by the way. We'll see him meet Griffith's gaze in the distance, but without giving in to anger or anything, he'll simply close his eyes and fall asleep, as if completely abandoning his hatred. On the boat, we start to see the effects of the Berserker's armor on Guts, as his eyesight begins to blur a little. We can also see his realization that some things are irreplaceable when, as Casca falls from the boat, he can't catch her, unlike the other times she's fallen in the same way. This repetition is quite funny, by the way. In short, it reinforces his conviction to protect what he has left. But the beast inside him, which only comes out because of the Berserker armor now, and which he's managing to control better and better with Shirka's help, will surface again in a nightmare, telling him this: "Don't imagine you can tie us under this yoke. The moment I obtained this shell, I was already released. New companions, a woman to protect, a warm light. Yes, for now you can hold on to these fragile chains, but as long as they're close to you, the more they bind themselves to us, the more they expose themselves to the claws of death. And one day death will crush them and tear them apart, just like that day. Yes, tie yourself to them, only to lose them even more. And then, with no one to stop me, I'll devour you. We'll rush in full of hatred and mad joy to crush with these fangs the true light that burns us." In short, the beast is teasing us to show that no matter how hard Guts tries, the trauma is so great that it can never really be erased, and that he is somehow doomed to have to fight again and again against himself to leave the beast lurking in the shadows while protecting his companions. The chains that keep the beast captive keep him from going mad. Later, on the island of the sea god, he will once again have to resort to the Berserker armor and fight the beast, and he'll be able to do it again, thanks to the Moonchild and Shirka, despite the fact that the armor's odds seems to grow more powerful with time. And after the ultra-epic battle against the sea god, where Guts once again had to outdo himself by using the Berserker's armor, His eyesight will deteriorate even further, his fingers will start to tremble. In short, everything the Skull Knight had told him. Which is pretty terrible for Guts, because if there's one thing he's been able to rely on all these years, it's his body. And his body seems to be gradually beginning to pay for all the excesses Guts has put it through. But he's finally coming to the end of his journey. And he's going to wonder what he's going to do next. How will Casca react once her sanity returns? Will he seek Griffith out for revenge? The beast is still lurking close to him. Anyway, Guts finally arrives on Skellig, the island of the elves. After a little new lore, a little talk about Griffith and a meeting with Danon, Guts will let Shirka and Farnese go and bring Casca to his senses. This is important to note because this time it's not Guts who will heroically rescue his wife but his companions, whom he'll have to trust with this crucial task. Meanwhile, Guts will have to wait. He'll have a chat with Serpico and Roderick, where he'll summarize his evolution since the eclipse, be a little self-critical and show that he's aware that it's thanks to his openness to others that he's been able to progress in this way. In short, Guts seems at last at peace. Then comes Casca's awakening. And then we have a truly magnificent, almost unreal chapter, where Guts finally finds Casca, after all these years of fighting again and again, going through everything I've mentioned in this video. And then, on seeing him, Casca flips out and collapses. The truth is, she still doesn't remember Griffith's rescue and the eclipse, and every time she sees or hears Guts, these traumatic memories resurface, preventing him from even having a conversation with her. After all his efforts, he can't touch her, can't look at her, can't do anything. He can do nothing but stay away from the one he loves. After that, Guts gets a glimpse of what the Skull Knight experienced through the Berserker armor and eclipse. During this eclipse, it becomes clear that he lost his wife, and that he then sank completely into hatred, letting the armor get the better of him. The Skull Knight thus becomes a kind of example to Guts of what he would become if he let himself be swallowed up by the beast inside him. And speaking of the armor, we get to see his eyesight fail, and his hands tremble to the point of letting his sword slip from his grasp. Finally, the Moonchild's arrival on the island marks the last major element in the Guts Miura drew during his lifetime. The Moonchild's arrival lends an air of paradise to this moment in the work. Admittedly, Guts can't see Casca, but we can tell ourselves that this will be remedied in time, and besides, the whole Guts group seems perfectly serene, happy, and close-knit. Casca looks after Moonchild like a mother, which is normal, since he's her son, and even Guts looks after him. Incidentally, to put to rest the unhealthy father-son relationship he had with Gambino, the scene in which he plays warrior with the Moonchild is far removed from the days when Gambino trained violently with a grown-up sword, making him risk his life on the battlefield. In short, this final chapter of Berserk drawn by Miura has all the makings of a happy ending, that is, until the last page. For yes, as the attentive reader realized long ago, Moonchild and Griffith share the same body, and when the full moon disappears, Griffith resurfaces, in front of Guts and Casca. And that's when it gets really crazy. Just imagine all that's involved. Admittedly, Guts doesn't yet know that the Moonchild is the cursed child, and therefore his son, but he's bound to find out sooner or later, or at least suspect it. But what this means is that if Guts wants to kill Griffith, he'll also have to kill his own son at the same time. And once again, we find that moment when Gambino tried to kill him. Moreover, Casca understood in the last chapter who the Moonchild was. She knows it's her son, and in my opinion she'd never want to let Guts kill him by killing Griffith at the same time, even if she remembers what the latter did to her during the eclipse, which is not guaranteed by the way. Imagine all the dramatic tension this will create. In short, the whole thing stinks to high heaven. But before I move on to the conclusion of this video, I'm still going to do a little bit about the 6 chapters that Koji Mori and Miura's former assistants have drawn so far after Miura's death. As I know that some people are waiting for the volumes or haven't read them simply because they didn't want to, I'll let you, if you don't want to be spoiled, skip to the conclusion. Guts right away goes for Griffith of course, but he doesn't manage to hit him. We're not sure whether this is due to a specific power Griffith possesses. We've already seen him receive a salvo of arrows without being hit, for example, or whether it's just Guts who, as we saw earlier, can't see very well, which is also suggested by a box where we see him looking at his hand, and where it looks like he's seeing hazily. Zod will come in and confront Guts, but the latter will still run towards Griffith, who will use Casca as a human shield. Guts will have to stop his sword, his hands trembling. Then Griffith will flee, taking Casca with him and destroying a good part of the island in the process. And then Guts is going to fall apart like never before. For the first time he drops his sword, the sword he's carried with him since childhood to protect himself, the sword he once considered his reason for living, even though it's been useless. Never in 41 volumes had Guts stopped fighting, he always kept going no matter what happened to him, whether with courage or simply blind rage. But here he couldn't fight anything. His one eye seeing less and less well, his hands trembling and preventing him from using his sword properly, it was hopeless. And if even his body could no longer hold out, if even his sword was no longer at his side, Guts could do nothing. In short, in the latest chapter to be released, nothing defines Guts' situation better than the word despair. Guts is a character who has suffered a lot, like really a lot. And if he's considered by many to be one of the most badass characters ever, it's because he always faces up to his suffering by fighting hard, without ever giving up, all the while remaining human in the face of superhuman enemies, against whom he has very little chance, defying death and destiny, even God himself. But as we've seen, things aren't quite that simple. Guts is a character who has always been very sensitive, even fragile. The universe he's been immersed in since childhood, and all the horrors he's been through in it, have strengthened him to the extreme, but have also caused him irreparable damage. Although he has buried them deep inside him behind a solid suit of armor, we know that the slightest crack in it could cause them to resurface, and this makes Guts all the more impressive, as we see him constantly fighting not just against others, but against himself as well, often finding himself on the precipice, one hair's breadth away from toppling over. But he's also a character with a very grey morality, who, while basically good-hearted, will be led to commit acts of extreme barbarity at certain points in the story, and in general, will still kill a bunch of people, not to mention his innermost thoughts, which show us quite clearly that he's half-mad. But he's aware of all that, and Guts is also a character who has repeatedly been able to question himself, to evolve, and who, far from the image of the big, virile, solitary man that some fans have of him, has learned to trust and to trust again in others, to accept their help in order to rebuild himself little by little, showing us that even an extremely strong man, mentally and physically, will always need the help of others. In short, all this suffering and will to overcome these trials by never giving up and knowing how to question himself makes Guts a character for whom we have both great empathy and admiration. All the more so as this is a character we're literally going to follow throughout his life, getting to know in every detail, and whose story is told to us with a master's hand, both in terms of content and form, thanks to the quality of the writing as a whole, but also through the drawings, the paneling, the dialogues, and everything that serves the manga's staging, enabling a fascinating reading, both explicit and implicit. And if, unfortunately, his destiny is no longer in the hands of Kentaro Miura, we'll still see what the master had in store for him through Koji Mori, his best friend, to whom he handed over the keys to the script. Then perhaps in a few years' time, we'll see the conclusion of this story and of the character of Guts, and perhaps we'll be able to write the end of this video and find out whether or not a human being can, through willpower and mutual aid, by honing to the extreme his individuality as much as his sense of community, succeed in defying fate itself. In the meantime, this analysis remains incomplete, but I've tried to make it as complete as possible, based on what we have at the moment, for this character who was so close to my heart, Guts. Well, I warned you it would be long. Well done to those who made it to the end of the video. As I said in the introduction, Guts is my favorite character in any medium, and that's why I wanted to make the best video I could, without worrying about the length of the video or how long it was going to take me. And as you can imagine, it took me a long time. I really don't know what's going to happen in terms of views with such a long video. I'm a bit afraid it'll fail, to be honest. But anyway, I'm really happy with the video, so that's the main thing. But it's still cool to see your work being broadcast, so I invite you to share the video around you, to like, comment, etc. You can also subscribe and follow me on Twitter or Twitch if you want. There are all the links in the description. The next video on Berserk won't be for a while yet, but I can tell you that we're going to be talking about Griffith, and there's a lot to say about him too. I'll probably be making several videos, because videos lasting over an hour aren't going to be an everyday occurrence either, and just thinking about it gives me a headache. In the meantime, feel free to have a look at the other videos on the channel, and see you next time.